Could we be getting a Dragon Age Origins remaster? Well, the lead writer wants to do just that. And they also said that EA never really grasped the Dragon Age series. So, best case scenario, what? A Dragon Age Origins remaster without EA and their grubby hands all over everything? Let's go ahead and dive into the video and see what is up here. This comes to us from Bounding Into Comics. And they said here, Dragon Age Origins lead writer proposes remaster, feels EA never understood the series. Okay, now I think, this is like very zoomed in from yesterday. I think Dragon Age Origins was one of the great, like, it was one of the amazing games of its time that kind of ended that era around that time. This was like 2009, the end of 2009, if I remember correctly, when this game originally dropped. And y'all hear me say this all the time. Gaming has gone severely downhill, especially when it comes to AAA Western titles. We're seeing them be a lot more babied down for the lowest common denominator of non-gamers who have kind of inserted themselves into the hobby. Gaming started to go a lot more mainstream. Games got babied down. Games started focusing a lot more on stories as opposed to gameplay around this time as well. And gamers who were called casuals back in the day are more hardcore now, because that's just where we're at. People want to sit and watch a pretty story and they want to call themselves a gamer, but they don't want any actual challenge associated with it, or they don't want to see video games be video games. They care a lot more about just watching a pretty story or shipping characters. Now, I know with Dragon Age and me saying, oh, Dragon Age Origin is one of the greatest games of its time, I know it has some of these elements, right? It does have a very gripping story. It has a very deep, good story. And it also has the dynamic of being able to ship yourself with a character. So I get it. There are some of those elements there, but I do feel like the focus as a whole with Dragon Age Origins, I mean, this is a game. This is a game, and it's an amazing game. So while it does have some of those elements, that's not the entire focus. I think these non-gamers just kind of latched on to some of those elements. It got some of them into the game, into gaming, but that's all they wanted to see, right? And so we've seen games kind of be gutted and not so much focus on being games anymore. Now, I will agree too with the lead writer saying that EA never really understood the series, and I feel like, you know, for me, man, I remember just being really excited about Dragon Age Inquisition and then playing it, having a blast with it at first, but then just being like, I don't know. I just couldn't. It just didn't have that same spark as Origins did, for example. So anyway, let me just continue with this article before I get too much into my own opinions. All right, so the lead writer has sparked discussion over whether the game should be remastered and how EA treated the series. So, amid numerous remakes and remasters, Dragon Age Origins lead writer David Gaider threw his proposal into the ring. If we're on a kick remastering games for the aughts, what about Dragon Age Origins? Its graphics were behind the curve even at the time of release. Can you imagine it with a brand new PS5 era bells and whistles? And back during this time, people, like actual gamers, we could forgive graphics not being as spectacular. You know what I mean? Like, if the game is legit really good, that's how I've always felt with Tomb Raider also, for example. I would rather see a good Tomb Raider game that doesn't put so much emphasis on just the fancy cutscenes and actually focus on the gameplay itself and letting the game tell the story through the gameplay. I care more about that. That's just where I'm at. All right, so I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Gaider even replied to some users discussing the validity and likelihood of a remaster. He says, dude, I don't know if that game could carry any more bells and whistles. Praised Handelsoup. It was already a double wide kitchen bathtub of systems and content. Even Inquisition level graphics would be great, Geider relented. Look, all I want is for Morgan to not have the shoulders of a linebacker and for the sex scenes to not look like someone bashing marionettes together and shouting, "Now kiss." I do like what he said about Morgan. I can agree with that. Now, I will say when it comes to the intimate scenes, like, please, though, for the love of God, don't. I'm not in the camp of having gratuitous sex scenes in games. I don't like them in movies. In games, it's just like, dude, keep it. Like, keep it to the imagination is my take on this sort of thing. Like, okay, you can imply it, all fine and good, but I don't, I play a video game to be a video game, man. To me, once you get too much into this kind of territory, it starts to be a little weird. For me, that's just me, but hey. You guys have your own opinions. Samuel Perseo highlighted that there shouldn't be a need for a Dragon Age Origins remaster. By the way, Origins still works on modern PCs with a few fixes from 15-year-old forums. I tried to launch Jade Empire yesterday and I could not because of DLL issues. Even before discussing remakes, it would be nice to count on basic support to make sure you can run the games. And I relate to this when it comes to Tomb Raider as well. When you look at the actual classic titles on Steam, they do not run well. Okay, Steam, GOG, whatever platform of your choice. So the classic Tomb Raider runs best if you just have a CRTV and you're in a PS1 and you're playing it that way. That is the best way to play classic Tomb Raider at this present time. Granted, there are some mods and such among the Tomb Raider community that can make the Steam versions of the games run a lot better. Some better than others, but especially if you're trying to stream it and you want the cutscenes, all that, you're going to run into a lot of issues. It's just, they don't work that well. And to me, when you have such big legacy titles, I feel like, does the developer just not want to cash out on these opportunities more? It wouldn't take as much work as a full-scale remaster would. And at this point, and the way that games are changed and remasters and remakes take a lot of the life out of them, I almost would rather just have a port that works really well at this point. So that's just kind of where I'm at. But anyway, let's continue this. I guess it's a question for the publisher, although one has to wonder how long they're expected to continue to support an old game, Geider argues. True, but again, like, dude, you don't have to do that much. Just something, man. All right, based on the replies of my Twitter friends in general, this would sell like hotcakes, proposed Elemental Amber. Geider then explained what the main linchpin is on whether a Dragon Age Origins remaster would happen. I suspect EA would only do it if they thought it would sell like gold-plated hotcakes. They've never really gotten Dragon Age or understood why it sold better than Mass Effect, was my impression, Geider explained. This is kind of how I feel about how things have been with the state of Tomb Raider as well. And when Square Enix had the publishing rights to Tomb Raider, it was just like, they just would not get it through their heads how much the fan base really wanted remasters, and they just want the games to freaking work, dude. And that you got yourself some hotcakes ready to sell. But unless it's like golden hotcakes, okay, I don't know, dude. But when you look at the developmental costs of mainline titles and games that are like modern, because there is so much focus on cutscenes, mocap, and all the expenses that come with that, especially if you're looking at rebooted Tomb Raider, for example, which I'm hijacking this video to talk about Tomb Raider, but look at rebooted Tomb Raider, right? What is the main draw of the rebooted Tomb Raider games? It's the story, it's the cutscenes, right? That's just where they put all their focus on these dramatic stories, because when you really unpack it in the actual gameplay itself, nothing spectacular, nothing that really stands out. It is an inferior version of Uncharted in a lot of ways. The elements that make Tomb Raider are not present in the rebooted games, and the fact that exploration, puzzles, all that just takes a backseat to the story, the linear focus. Tombs are optional even. I mean, it's just absurd that a game called Tomb Raider and tombs are optional. And then once you actually go in the tombs, they're pretty, easy puzzles, like nothing that difficult, nothing that grand. It doesn't have the elements of what made Tomb Raider. And because most of the focus was on the overdramatic story, which I didn't even like, it just sucks to see that that's where all the budget went to, was into these, overly dramatic cinematic cutscenes, turning Tomb Raider into Lara's drama personal life, which was never what Tomb Raider was about. And so you had all these expenses tied to it, and you had these games that have cost over $100 million a piece to create. You beat the games once, and it's like you really don't have much of a purpose to play it beyond that, because you've already experienced the story. It's done. It's over with. Now what? There's not as much substance in the games themselves to really hold beyond that. So what this leads to is when you have these monumental budgets that are just astronomical, and especially for games that most people are only going to play through one time every so often. I mean, they might revisit it again a few years later, but for the most part, most people are just going to play through them once. Then it's like, is it really worth it? And when you looked at the profit margins for the rebooted Tomb Raider games, for example, they were just pretty much non-existent. It was like barely breaking even at best. And then you look at something like classic Tomb Raider, which adjusted for inflation, you had more of $1 million budgets, and the sales were in the millions. So people were able to, on the dev team and through royalties, were able to retire because of that, because of how much money they were making on those games. So I don't get it. Why are you throwing all this money at these games that are barely breaking even, when you can fix the classics, the legacy stuff, the stuff that's actual games that just like for so cheap? But alas, okay, I will save this rant and stay on topic. All right, so I was always confused as to why they tried to make it more like Mass Effect, more action-oriented, dialogue wheel, voiced protagonist with less lines, if it sold better and was more critically acclaimed, which I think that's very fair. And especially when you look, Mass Effect's a lot more sci-fi, and then you have, it is sci-fi, and then you have Dragon Age, it's fantasy. It's funny, I made a poll about this how long ago. I said if you had to choose between sci-fi or fantasy, one has to go away forever, which would you pick? I think the majority slightly went with sci-fi, but me personally, I would go with fantasy. But that's beside the point. But in this case, when you think about, look at your audiences and all that. When you look at the fantasy genre, okay, you've got a lot more room for some really, you can really wade deep into the nerd elements. I mean, the role-playing elements, the D&D side of things. Think of like Divinity, right? Some more of those kind of elements that can go into it, and more, quite frankly, RPG elements as opposed to action, right? Not that there weren't RPG elements, but I'm just saying you could really dig deeper into there and go even more nerdy into that, right? Personally, I think would be a good option when you really look at, like, really hone in on those fantasy genre players, right? A good question. Guider replied, seemingly just as confused. I guess people thought Mass Effect was more slick and modern, and thus should have more commercial appeal. Common wisdom is an insidious thing. I definitely agree with this, though. I definitely think it's a good point, because Mass Effect, while it does have like a lot of those RPG elements and all the dialogue wheel, the dialogue options, all this kind of stuff, I do feel like Mass Effect does give more of an action-y vibe, and it's going to appeal more to people who are going to find it more easy to just dive into versus something like a Divinity, right? Divinity Original Sin or something like that. So yeah, I think this is very fair. At this time, EA and BioWare have been working on Dragon Age Dreadwolf, but a release date has not been announced at this time. Okay, and just for my personal opinion, knowing the way that modern games are, that modern games do cater a lot more to that common denominator. Let's make these games as accessible to a widespread audience as possible, especially a lot of the newcomers and people who weren't traditionally gamers and what they want to see. And so we're getting these baseline experiences that try to appeal to everyone. And in doing so, they're really not appealing to nobody, right? When you try to appeal to everybody, you're reaching that most common denominator non-gamer, as opposed to really just diving deep. Okay, hit that niche deep. That's what I want to see more of. I want to see more of that with games. I mean, let's look at like Soulsborne games and what they do. They hit the niche. Even though with Elden Ring, it is, in terms of Soulsborne games, it is more accessible than other Soulsborne games. But as a whole, you're targeting a niche of gamer. You're not hitting that super mainstream common denominator. Non-gamers just aren't really into games like Soulsborne titles. And I'm not saying by any means that every game has to be a Soulsborne game. Not every game has to take Soulsborne elements and copy them. But what makes Soulsborne games such an amazing example is just targeting a niche and focusing on making that niche happy. And I want to see more games do this. Instead of just trying to appeal to everybody, appeal to your niche. And so with something like Dragon Age, like I was just saying, you can really dive huge, like way deeper into that fantasy genre niche, that super like fantasy RPG element. Right? That's what you can dive a lot more into like the role play, like all that. You can really go more into that isn't going to be as accessible to people who, that might be too nerdy for them. Okay, this is too much. Wait, this is too much numbers. This is too much, like all that, right? And I think the same with Tomb Raider, right? Why not focus on the niche? The classic games had a niche audience, even though Tomb Raider had widespread appeal because of Lara Croft as a character. That's truly the reason. Because the gameplay itself was catered toward more of a niche audience, and a lot of people aren't into it. That's why you'll see a lot of people talk about, when I make videos talking about the reboot, and they will say things like, but I like the reboots best. I like them best. Well, that's because you follow more of a mainstream gaming style. And hey, that's fine, but that's just not what the original Tomb Raider games were designed for. Okay, so people who really, just think of something that you're super passionate about and you're super into, right? You're gonna want to get as nerdy and as entrenched into said thing as possible. You're not going to want a light version, right? You're not going to want the light version that everybody can play. You're going to want to get more into the trenches with it. You're going to want to get more nerdy with it. And so that's what it, like with Tomb Raider, when you look at classic Tomb Raider, I mean, this had the entire control system and the entire traversal system was a game within itself. You completely change the dynamic of the game when you switch from manual grab to auto grab, for example, or when you take away the acrobatics that played a pivotal role in the gameplay. Like looking at a jump ahead of time and saying, okay, wait a minute. You had to calculate it. You had to do like physics, math, all this stuff. You had to calculate things in your head. You think, okay, wait a minute. This is going to take a back step. I'm going to have to run to the edge, take a back step, perform a running jump. Then she's going to slide down and I'm going to have to do a backflip twist and grab the edge. Like you have to calculate things before you do them. Or sometimes you're in a position where you have something chasing you or whatever, like a boulder or whatever, and you have to think on your feet really quick. Oh, you have to calculate this maneuver And you don't have that much you don't have long to think about it, right? So certain people are going to find that frustrating. Certain people who, you know, they just want to see Lara Croft, you know, that's why they played Tomb Raider, was only for Lara Croft. Then they're only going to just want to see her. They don't want to have to do that extra work, right? So let people put in the work. Okay? I'm going to be ranting for entirely too long, but when I get into like gaming topics, especially, this happens, the state of where games are now. So cater more towards the niche, man. You don't have to, and when you do so, then you don't have to focus as much on the super expensive elements. You don't have to have everything, the most cutting edge graphics, the most like the facial mocap, all this kind of stuff, the most high profile actors to take on these voice acting roles, this, that, or the other. You don't have to do that if you're catering to a niche with your gameplay, especially. And there's almost a charm to the outside elements of it not being as, you know, modern, right? As not being as mainstream. There's a charm to it. So that's my take on everything. I'm curious to know what you guys think in the comments below. But thank you all so much for hanging out with me today. I will catch you next time. In the meantime, go boom.